June 1815. A man who had ruled an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia stepped aboard a British warship as a prisoner. No crown, no army, no future. Just the slow voyage to a volcanic island in the South Atlantic, from which he would never return. At his peak, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the most powerful land force in European history. He had broken Austria at Austerlitz, shattered Prussia at Jena in a matter of weeks, and humiliated Russia at Friedland. Kings negotiated with him from a position of fear. For nearly a decade, the map of Europe moved according to his will. So how did it end on a British ship? Not because Wellington was smarter, not because Kutuzov outmaneuvered him, not because Nelson was braver. Napoleon was brought down by 5 decisions he made himself, at moments when no one had the power to stop him. Each mistake fed the next. Each one opened a wound that never fully closed. By the time the final battle came at Waterloo, the empire was already hollow, bled dry by a cascade of errors made at the height of his power. This is not a story about how Napoleon's enemies beat him. It is a story about how he beat himself. The first crack appeared long before most people realize. In 1798, Napoleon could not touch Britain directly. The English Channel and the Royal Navy made any invasion impossible, and he knew it. So he devised an alternative, a campaign that would threaten Britain's trade routes through the Mediterranean and establish a French presence in Egypt. Roughly 38,000 French troops landed on the Egyptian coast, and early victories followed quickly. The Battle of the Pyramids confirmed French land superiority. Napoleon moved deeper into Egyptian territory with confidence. But his plan had a fatal assumption buried inside it. He believed the French fleet anchored off the coast could hold its position long enough to keep his army supplied and connected to France. He believed the Royal Navy could not project decisive force fast enough to challenge that. He was wrong. British Admiral Horatio Nelson had been hunting the French fleet across the Mediterranean for weeks. On August 1st, 1798, he found it at Aboukir Bay on the Egyptian coast. What followed was a destruction, not a battle. 11 of 13 French ships of the line were sunk or captured. The French fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force in the eastern Mediterranean. Overnight, Napoleon's army was stranded. The supply line to France was severed. When he pushed north into Syria the following year and laid siege to the fortress of Acre, British naval guns positioned just offshore resupplied the defenders and repelled every French assault. The Syrian campaign collapsed. Napoleon made a decision that would define his reputation in a different way. In August 1799, he quietly abandoned his army in Egypt and slipped back to France. The army he left behind eventually surrendered to the British in 1801. He survived. His political career recovered. Within a year, he was first consul of France. But Britain had learned something. It had learned that Napoleon was vulnerable at sea, and the Royal Navy would use that knowledge relentlessly. By 1805, Napoleon sat at the center of a European empire no one had built so quickly since Rome. Austria had been pressured into submission. Prussia was next. Russia was manageable. Only Britain remained, unconquered, financed by global trade and protected by water. Napoleon assembled an invasion flotilla at Boulogne on the northern French coast. Roughly 2,000 vessels and 150,000 troops waiting for the right moment to cross the channel. The plan required French naval control of those narrow waters for just long enough to get the army across. He tasked Admiral Villeneuve with the operation. The scheme called for Villeneuve to draw British naval attention toward the Caribbean with a feint, then return, briefly seize the channel, and allow the crossing. It was a sophisticated plan. It failed completely. Villeneuve could not bring himself to engage the British fleet directly. He retreated into the harbor at Cadiz on the southwestern coast of Spain. Napoleon, furious, accused him of cowardice. When Villeneuve finally sailed to escape the accusation, Nelson was waiting. On October 21, 1805, off Cape Trafalgar, the combined Franco-Spanish fleet was destroyed. 18 Allied ships were captured or sunk. The British lost none. Nelson was killed in the victory, but Britain had achieved something permanent: unchallenged control of every sea lane. The Channel invasion was cancelled. Napoleon's colonies became isolated. French maritime power, already weakened by Egypt, was finished. He pivoted immediately. Within weeks, he smashed the Austrian army at Austerlitz in one of the most brilliant battles ever fought. His land power was untouchable, but Britain remained beyond his reach, trading freely, financing his enemies, and organizing coalitions against him from behind the safety of the ocean. So in November 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree. Every port on the European continent was now closed to British trade. The logic was economic strangulation. Deny Britain its markets, collapse its finances, force it to negotiate. He called it the continental system. The idea was not unreasonable. Britain's strength rested on commerce. On paper, cutting it off from 60 million European customers should have caused serious damage. But the blockade was never tight enough. Smugglers moved British goods across every border. European merchants, dependent on British manufactured products and trade relationships built over generations, quietly found ways around the restrictions. French-controlled economies suffered from the shortages more acutely than Britain did. Meanwhile, Britain adapted, opening new commercial relationships in South America and the Ottoman Empire to replace what it lost in Europe. To make the system work, Napoleon needed to control every port, every stretch of coastline, every harbor master in Europe. And there were two places along the Atlantic coast where the blockade kept breaking down: Portugal and, increasingly, Russia. Portugal refused to close its ports entirely to British ships. Napoleon decided it had to be occupied. In October 1807, a French army crossed Spain under General Junot and seized Lisbon. Portugal fell quickly. The British royal family escaped by sea. No serious resistance materialized. It looked easy. That moment of ease was the most dangerous thing that could have happened to Napoleon. Seeing how effortlessly French forces had moved through Spain, seeing how fragile the Spanish monarchy had become through its own internal conflicts, Napoleon decided on an act of imperial opportunism that he would spend the rest of his life paying for. In March 1808, he summoned the Spanish royal family to Bayonne in France, manipulated them into abdications, and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Spain. He expected what he had seen elsewhere across Europe: populations that grumbled, then accepted, armies that fought a battle or two, then surrendered or submitted. Spain was different in every way. On May 2, 1808, Madrid rose against the French garrison. The uprising was suppressed with brutal force. The artist Francisco Goya recorded the executions of civilians in paintings that became symbols of the entire war. But the violence did not end resistance. It multiplied it. From one end of the Iberian Peninsula to the other, something ignited that Napoleon's army had never encountered at scale. The word the Spanish used for it entered the English language permanently: guerrilla. Thousands of irregular fighters operated from the mountains, valleys, and villages of Spain. They did not face French columns in open battle. They appeared from nowhere, struck supply convoys on the roads, isolated messengers, ambushed foraging parties, and then dissolved back into the landscape before French cavalry could respond. As one Prussian officer serving with the French described them, wherever the French arrived, they disappeared. Wherever the French left, they returned. They were everywhere and nowhere. French control in Spain was real only where French troops were physically standing. The cities, Madrid, Burgos, Seville, Barcelona, could be held. The roads between them could not. Every convoy moving south from the Pyrenees required a heavy armed escort. Every garrison was under permanent threat. And while the guerrillas tied down French manpower across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, a British and Portuguese army under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and began pressing eastward along the Atlantic seaboard. At its peak, more than 300,000 French troops were committed to the Iberian Peninsula. Historian Charles S. Dial estimates French dead in Spain at approaching 250,000, though casualty figures from this conflict vary considerably across sources. Napoleon himself eventually called it the Spanish ulcer. The name was accurate. It bled continuously, consumed resources without resolution, and never healed. Wellington defeated French armies at Salamanca in 1812 and Vittoria in 1813. By the end of 1813, French forces had been pushed back across the Pyrenees and were defending French soil. The worst part was the cascade. Every French soldier locked in Spain was a soldier who could not be sent east. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, he would need every man he could find. He did not have them. By 1810, Tsar Alexander I had quietly withdrawn Russia from the continental system. Russian merchants needed British trade. The Russian economy could not sustain the disruptions of the blockade. From Napoleon's perspective, this was not merely a commercial disagreement. It was a direct challenge to the entire strategic architecture he had built. If Russia defied the system openly, others would follow. The continental system would collapse, Britain would remain undefeated, and everything he had constructed would begin to unravel. In June 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russia. The force was staggering, somewhere in the range of 600,000 men drawn from France, the German states, Poland, Italy, and across the empire. It was the largest army ever assembled in European history to that point. Napoleon expected what he had always needed: a decisive battle, a shattered Russian army, and a peace treaty negotiated from a position of total dominance. His operational method had produced this result against every major European power. Fast movement, concentration at the decisive point, destruction of the enemy's main force, political capitulation to follow. The entire system depended on the enemy fighting back. Russia refused. The Russian commanders, first Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, executed a strategy of systematic withdrawal. As French columns advanced eastward along the roads from Vilna through Smolensk toward Moscow, Russian forces retreated before them, destroying everything that might sustain the invaders. Granaries were burned, livestock was slaughtered, wells were fouled. The landscape ahead of the Grande Armée was stripped bare. The army moved forward through emptiness. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to Poland, thinning as they extended. Horses died, men weakened, disease spread. And still the enemy retreated, offering no decisive engagement, drawing the French deeper into a country that had swallowed armies before. The one major battle came at Borodino, near Moscow, in September 1812. It was brutal and inconclusive. The Russians lost around 44,000 men, the French around 35,000, and the Russian army slipped away in the night, undefeated. Napoleon occupied Moscow days later. He waited there for 5 weeks, waited for Alexander to send peace terms. The terms never came. Instead, the Russians burned the city around the French garrison, rather than leave it intact. Napoleon sat in the ruins of a capital whose government had refused to surrender, as autumn turned and the supply position became irretrievable. In October 1812, he ordered the retreat, 600 miles back through the same devastated corridor, now battered by early winter and relentless Russian pressure. Kutuzov's army pressed from the south. Cossack cavalry struck the flanks and supply columns from every direction. The road through Smolensk became a catastrophe measured in frozen kilometers. The Berezina River crossing in November 1812 stands as one of the most devastating moments of the entire campaign. Trapped on the eastern bank as Russian forces converged, thousands of French soldiers drowned or were cut down. Of the force that had crossed the Niemen with such confidence 5 months earlier, fewer than 100,000 returned in any condition to fight, though historians note that precise figures remain difficult to establish given the fragmented nature of the retreat. The Grande Armée had ceased to exist. By 1813, the consequences were immediate. Prussia, Austria, and Sweden joined Russia against France. Napoleon rebuilt an army and won tactical engagements at Lutzen and Bautzen, but the numbers were unsustainable. In October 1813 at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, French forces were overwhelmed by the combined weight of the coalition. By March 1814, Allied armies were marching toward Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. He escaped in March 1815. For 100 days, he tried to rebuild everything he had lost. He defeated the Prussians at Ligny on June 16th. But on June 18th, at Waterloo, he delayed the opening assault until midday to allow the ground to dry after overnight rain. That delay gave the Prussians under Blücher, who had escaped pursuit after Ligny, time to march to Wellington's position and reinforce it in the afternoon. Some historians have also noted that Napoleon left his most dependable operational commander, Marshal Davout, back in Paris to manage the government, bringing Marshal Ney to command the left wing instead. Ney's cavalry charged the Anglo-Allied infantry squares repeatedly across a narrow front without adequate artillery or infantry support. The charges failed each time. The exact cause of the initial cavalry action remains debated. Some historians, citing a letter written in 1835 by Captain Fortune de Brac, have suggested the charge may have begun by accident rather than direct order. What is clear is the result. The French cavalry was exhausted and shattered. When the Prussians arrived on the eastern flank and the final assault of the Imperial Guard was repulsed, the French army collapsed entirely. Napoleon abdicated for the second time 4 days later. He spent the remaining 6 years of his life on St. Helena, dictating his memoirs, shaping the story he wanted posterity to believe. What the memoirs could not change was the chain of logic that connected every disaster. Egypt revealed the naval vulnerability. The naval vulnerability produced the continental system. The continental system forced the Spanish intervention. The Spanish intervention created a permanent drain on French manpower and resources. The manpower shortage shaped the Russian campaign. The Russian campaign destroyed the army. The destroyed army made the coalitions of 1813 and 1814 unstoppable. And Waterloo, when it came, was less a battle lost than an epilogue to a story that had already been decided. Napoleon reportedly acknowledged on St. Helena that Spain was his greatest mistake. Some historians argue Russia deserves that designation. The debate continues because both answers contain truth. What is harder to debate is the pattern underneath all 5 decisions. Every single time, Napoleon underestimated one thing: the capacity of his enemies to resist in ways that did not fit the battles he knew how to win. Britain would not collapse under blockade. Spain would not submit to a foreign king. Russia would not stand and be destroyed on his schedule. The most dangerous enemy Napoleon Bonaparte ever faced was not across a battlefield. It was the version of himself that had stopped believing any of that was possible. Which of his 5 decisions do you think sealed the empire's fate? Let the argument begin below.